Hi guys, Chris here for 103 and we are up to architecture in week 11. Um, so let's get stuck straight in, shall we? And Kylie, you're first up. Um, Now, you mentioned in your information that you've given me that you wanted to get this juxtaposition between the stained glass window and the water stain. I think it's certainly an unusual subject and I think it's got some potential. Um, you mentioned the lighting was difficult, and yes, you're quite right, it is. I think the easiest solution in this case was for you to actually bring some of your own lighting into the situation. Um, Looking at the settings and stuff, it's still middle of the day type. Oh, there we go, 2 o'clock in the afternoon type time frame. I'm thinking that you've got two options with that. One is you either use an off-camera flash, if you've got one, and that would allow you to shoot and bounce light around and lighten up the interior at this time of day. The other potential alternative would be to wait until later in the evening, or early, yeah, probably late evening is the better option, and take along torches and do some light painting, or painting with light, and illuminate the rest of the room in the way that you need to. That allows you to play with longer exposure and deal with light sources that aren't quite as bright and powerful, and that would let you get that balance of light better. At the moment, given that the juxtaposition in the story really is the nice stained glass with the old water stain, you can't see the water stain well enough within the shot, and it just misses that. You've lined it up really well to get rid of the barrel distortion, which is great, but you haven't controlled your f-stop to give you the depth of field that you need in this case, particularly that you've included the banister rail, and from your comments quite deliberately, but that means that you need to use that probably F11 focus about here will give you enough depth of field to get both of those to work. The other thing that you need to be careful of is whenever you've got white areas within an image, you want to make sure that you've actually got detail within that white, and in this case you've lost that detail in the highlights, and even if I try and pull that information back, we've got patches in there that are blown out, so that's not going to work from that point of view. Hence why you need to probably bring some more lights in so that you can actually balance the two out. So, composition wise, sticking stuff smack bang in the middle of an image is not good form. And we've been over this a number of times. It stops you from wandering around the rest of the image. Now, you've got the potential here for this line of stairwell railing to act as a leading line um, towards the window, but it really should start from a little bit further out and travel in. So how do you do that? Well, you're going to have to play with your where you're standing and your lens to be able to get that to work. Do you need it? Well, probably not, given that your main aim of this is to show that juxtaposition. Then you actually don't need that added distraction in there. You can just go for the window and the staining and play around with this. Now, really, for an architecture shot, this is too close for what we're actually after you to get. We're trying to get you to look at taking photos of whole buildings, not just close-ups of individual features. But for the image that you were trying to achieve, this is more what I would go. And I've had to do quite a bit of manipulation with the post-production and selective adjustment to try and pull up or pull back the detail in the window and to brighten up the other areas, and to try and pull out some of that detail. So really the best solution is to do it in camera. Yes, it can be done in post-production, but thinking about how you can get it to work in camera and how you can control the lighting is a much better option. Right, Tony. Now, yeah, as you say, interesting, different viewpoint on on the landmark. Um, the challenge, though, that you've got is the lighting. It's not easy to deal with. You mentioned that you'd um, waited um, until later in the day to avoid the lens flare. I think that you might have wanted to play with it earlier in the morning too, potentially, because not having any direct light on the building means that you've got a very large mass of underexposed um, stonework, and so that your eye's drawn to this blue area, and that's pretty much it. The rest of it doesn't play with the space well and doesn't utilize the space. Yes, you use the rule of thirds for this, but this area here is so big and imposing and so underexposed that it limits the impact that the image could have. I've had a go with playing around and trying to bring out some of that detail just in straight post-production. I probably actually pushed it a little bit too far in terms of the exposure there. And I've also ended up playing with the exposure and highlights and just to try and balance things out a little bit, so that you can actually see the detail that you've managed to capture. Now, there's also some halos and stuff in here that I haven't got rid of, basically because it's going to take me ages to mask, and would be much better to be done in camera, because then you end up with a little bit more shape to the stonework as well. But yeah, it's just on the too far underexposed side of things, and I mean, if you just brightened up the overall exposure until that behaved itself, then yeah, you'd end up with a massive problem of the sky being blown out, and you don't want to do that. And obviously, being 103, you can't use HDR to fix the problem either. So the only real solution for this one is to wait for a different time of day so that the lighting's actually playing ball, and certainly a shot that I would look at retaking. The other challenge that you've got is your distortion. You do look like you've got this vertical on a vertical, but this clock tower is leaning away slightly. Now, that sort of works with the fact that you want things looming over the top, but it's also from good practice to make sure you've got enough room at the side of the building to actually do that lens correction without losing pieces. I tried it earlier and I was starting to lose bits of the window areas that needed to be there. And the other thing you need to do is either you need to clean your sensor, which there should be some material in the readings about, or you need to go through and make sure that you clone out any dots of lens dust spots on the sensor afterwards. Yeah, if you don't know how to clean your sensor, then make sure you do the research beforehand, because it is a really good way of wrecking your camera if you do it wrong. Right, Ashley, let's have a look at your one. So, in terms of your camera settings, you mentioned that your tripod died, which is never particularly helpful when you're trying to do architecture shots, because you do need to be able to play with that f-stop, and given the overcast nature of the day, you've not been able to extend your f-stop as much as you really needed to play with that depth of field. The exposure itself's okay, but it's the choice of those settings that's not as good as it could be. There is a minor glitch with the exposure, and that is, it looks more like a post-processing issue than anything else. You've got a lot of shadowing underneath the veranda, and you've got this line that's happening across here. Now it looks like you've selectively adjusted the sky, and my guess would be that you've utilized something that does like this, and you've pulled your exposure down just like that. Now, the problem with doing that is you can see where it's been done. You can see this line across the top here, the top of the clock tower ends up getting dark, and you don't want, when you're doing that post-production, for somebody to be able to look at it and go, oh, somebody's played with the post-production. Yes, it needs doing, but you want to do it in a way that that doesn't affect it, or ideally shoot it in weather that actually means that you don't need to. And in this case, the solution to that is to wait until a patch of sunlight comes through and streams through and hits the building. That means that your building is going to be well illuminated, and the sky naturally will be darker. Heck of a long time to wait, I know, and sometimes it's not possible. Hence why I cover both sides of it. You've got some really interesting leading lines here. The challenge is they lead down to a stop sign and a white gate. Not the strongest thing to lead them to. If we could see a bit more of the clock tower, then maybe that could lead us to the tower itself, and that could be a focal point. If you didn't have the reduction in brightness over the sign here, maybe that could have been a focal point. Potentially you could have cropped in and got rid of some of the road as well, which might have helped. However, the other thing that should have picked up in your readings and in the video is how to get rid of this barrel distortion, this bow that you've got around the edge of this white pole, and that's simply by pulling that in like that. Now, once that's done, you've then got a bit of lean on this building. I think you must have done some adjustment already, given that probably not expecting to get both of these vertical, but there we go. Let's see what we can do. That's about it. Right, so that's that done. Then you have to crop in to make sure you get rid of any of the white areas, and unfortunately you haven't quite left yourself enough room to do that, and it's ending up cropping off the top of the building there, which is less than ideal. And that's just something you have to make sure that when you're doing your shot, you give yourself a little bit more room to be able to do that manipulation, and not lose the top of of buildings, because having your composition here and that little bit of a gap works quite well. Not having it starts to cause problems, and of course that means that you can't edit it anymore. But yeah, good that you've included it in the original. Right, Sean, let's have a look at yours. Now, a couple of quick notes. You mentioned that you had to clone out the vignetting you used from because you'd used a lens hood incorrectly, but you'd also had to clone out lens flare. Now, my guess would be that you've put the wrong sized lens hood on your camera. An 18mm camera only has a lens hood that's maybe 2 centimeters deep. Any more than that and you end up with, probably as you found out, you end up with a black line or black ring around it, and the standard bigger lens hoods are maybe 6 centimeters long, but yeah, they will cause you problems because they start blocking out the edge of the image, which is unfortunate. Square crop, it has potential. I think you would have been better off had you gone and played with different angles. My guess is that you were actually stuck inside, because you mentioned about cleaning off the bird poo off the window, and I'm quite glad you mentioned it, because I was getting horrendously worried about whatever this was here. Let's just crank up the contrast and clarity so that you can actually see it. There is something on, and I was originally getting worried that you got scratches or something on your sensor, but I'm guessing that that's muck on the window. So you really don't want to shoot through windows unless you absolutely have to. It also limits where you can actually go in terms of getting your camera up close and stepping in and probably being between the building and these poles might have actually given you a really interesting angle down through to the stairs as well. In terms of the building, it's not quite working for me. And for starters, you've not quite got it vertical with the pipes. But at that point, I'd actually be looking at trying to crop it so that the image is canted to try and utilize the zoom of the lines that you've got in there to help draw you into this point. You might be able to do it better with yours, because by the time I was zooming in, the only focal point that you've really got is this entrance way, and it was getting cropped in too close. But the reason that I do that is to get rid of some of this grass, because the grass is quite bright, and it's a strong colour, so it's drawing between this and the sky. They're both drawing your eye away from the building, which, although it's got some interesting shapes in it, is a dull grey green, or dull green on the dark grey, and so it just doesn't have as much impact as it could do. The other thing you need to be aware of is when you're taking photos of architecture, you're wanting to play with that depth of field. 400 ISO and a small f-stop is not small f-stop is not appropriate. You want to be using the f10 or so. Drop down your shutter speed to counter it, and cranking your ISO up to 500. Not so good, because you start getting image noise, so you do need to be aware of what you're doing with your camera settings when you're taking those images. And I'm not sure, but I think that you actually probably overexposed your sky in the original shot, and you've just played with it to try and get some detail back. I could be wrong. It could just be that it's a very flat sky where there isn't any clouds, but it would have been nice to have some detail in there, not just have it bright white, because as I said, like the grass, it's fighting for your attention rather than letting you focus on the building. Right, Erin. Okay, so architectural home, and you've actually included the architect standing at the kitchen making breakfast, which I think is quite an interesting change to the, and it kind of adds a little bit to the story. I think it would have been nice to actually wait until the person was actually turned around the other way. At the moment, seems like they're a little bit of an accidental addition rather than a deliberate one from a compositional point of view. The other thing is that the table and chairs are somewhat getting in the way. I think that you've got all of this nice architecture going on, but you're getting distracted by whatever is happening down here, and I don't know if they could have been moved out the way and just use the more permanent feature of the bench as part of that. The other thing, when you're doing internal stuff, and you'll cover this in 207, particularly when you start doing architecture stuff, is clearing bench spaces is really important. So the flower or bag that's on the bench really needs to head off somewhere else. You've generally done quite a good job of the exposure. It's a little bit underexposed, and there is a patch of light here, which is pure sunlight, and therefore is actually overexposed in your original shot. You've tried to recover it, but there's not enough detail there. So it still ends up as this white greyish area, which is not fantastic from that point of view, but fairly difficult when you're dealing with dappled light. The only the only real way of getting rid of that is to use something like an off-camera flash, bounce the flash behind you and have it illuminate the rest of the room. Potentially you could turn the lights on, but then you end up with colour color temperature issues, in that the lights will be a different color to the sunlight, and that can throw things out a little bit. So I would tweak it a little bit just to try and bring up those shadows. Ideally I'd like to deal with it in camera, but sometimes you can't. And the other thing that needed to be done is the verticals weren't quite vertical. Now in doing so, that's ended up cropping off the edge of the table, the chair. You'd actually already cropped off the edge of this chair, which isn't good. And I don't like doing that to straighten it up, because that makes that join there then becomes a focal point or a point of distraction. And the only way to get around that is to give yourself a little bit more room. That's easier said than done because you're dealing with 18mm, and I have a suspicion you're already backed into the corner, but it can be handled another way, i.e. potentially removing the chair, seeing as the chair's not the main feature of the shot. But you've used your f-stop well, and yeah, it's a 1/6 of a second exposure, which is pushing it a little bit for having people in, but she's a small part of the presuming it's a she. That can get me into all sorts of trouble, can't it? They're a small part of the image, and they're not moving fast, so yes, you can get around it, which is good. Right, Mez, let's have a look at yours. I have to say, a Mini driving up the side of a building is always something slightly interesting. In terms of your exposure settings, you're using a Nikon, so you don't have much choice in that 200 ISO. Just remember, if you're doing something where we actually say you need to use 100, if you don't have that ability, then, which often the Nikons don't, make sure that you actually say that you are in the lowest ISO. F11, that's fine. It's giving you a good depth of field, and you can see that through the image. Things are nice and clear and sharp, which is great. 200th of a second, potentially a little bit fast. You could have traded that off some more f-stop, but it's certainly good enough. And you have got a touch overexposed around the cross. There's still potentially some detail in that cloud, but you just want to knock it back a fraction. In terms of the general composition, that cross and the Mini make a nice focal point. I would actually crop down a little bit more. The main interest is the is the building, and what's going on. The skies is really just a placeholder, and so zooming in that little bit more just strengthens the story a bit. The lighting's angled enough that you're getting a sense of scale and shape to the building. Slightly confused by the fact that this is painted or plastered and this piece isn't, so it kind of almost makes this piece feel like it's surreal and heading backwards, and it's another light until you look at it more closely. But it works. It all comes together quite nicely. So yeah, well done. It's an interesting image, and well seen, and well found for the lighting to behave itself for you, which is good. Right, Heather, well composed. I love the fact that you've nailed the lines leading from the edge of the photo here, and as far as I know, this particular part of the building doesn't connect to this, so you've just done that simply through your composition, and the fact that you've left this little tiny triangle between the two works really well. It's a really strong image. The cloud formation's a little bit soft, which actually works in this case. You could have pulled your f-stop up to, well, what were you? You were sitting at 1/25th of a second, so you could have increased your f-stop and decreased your shutter speed and giving yourself a little bit more depth of field. But in this case, I don't think it's actually needed. What happens is that you end up with these really clean lines against a nice soft background, rather than it competing. I would lift this exposure in the shadows a fraction. But you'd have to do that from your raw file. The version that I've got, it's too dark, and you're getting a whole pile of digital noise in there, which is a bit of a shame. But yeah, it would be nice to just lift that to finish balancing this off, and it helps give you some of that colour tone that's in the cross between the two. And then you've also got, because it's a yellowy orange, you've got that complementary colour setup with the sky. So yeah, very well seen, very well thought about in terms of the composition and execution, so good job. Right, Bernadette, let's have a look at yours. And image size, etc. is behaving itself, which is good. And you've definitely got the right idea with 13th of a second, sorry, f13 to give you the decent shutter, the decent aperture, give you decent depth of field. Where things have gone a little bit squiffy is you've overexposed the image. If you have a look at your histogram, you've got all of this area, which is sky, which is highlight clipping. Now, you're in an interesting situation where you're trying to expose for the inside of the church, which is quite dark. So if you'd managed to get there even earlier and the church was open, then the light might have been a little bit lower and less intense, and so you might have been able to balance that anyway. Other than that, you can only pull it out of post-production. There's no detail in the sky in this area here, which means that it doesn't matter what you do to that, it's not actually going to solve the problem. You have to get that right in camera. But you could then lift the shadows a little so that you end up with this glow of the interior light actually looking as an inviting warm idea. And I'd say going back and trying this one again at either dawn or dusk, so that you end up with this light spilling out of the doorway, could work really well. Right, Amika, now you mentioned in your comments about the fact that you made changes in RAW and it started looking really grainy. I was actually going to say the opposite, which explains if you've tried to get rid of the grain, what's going on. It looks like it's got too much noise recovery applied to it, and so it's gone quite soft, and you're lacking some of the detail in the texture, and particularly around the concrete. So yeah, pretty sure what's happened is at some point you've applied too much noise reduction. Why has that happened? That gets me guessing. I would have to say that probably what's happened is you've exposed the image, you've exposed for the clouds reasonably well, but the building would have been quite dark, and you've played with it, pulled up the light on the building, and in doing so you've ended up with quite a noisy image because it's been pulled up so much. And the only real solution for that is to wait until the lighting changes so that you end up with a better lit building in the first place. I do like the composition, I do like the idea of catching this reflection. It just needs something a little bit, either a reflection of something in there, or maybe the person looking out. It's just missing that little bit of the rest of the storyline. And this bright patch here is quite bright, and so draws your eye up, and it would have been worth waiting until the clouds had shifted so that you ended up with this area being darker, and that'll naturally help draw your eye back into this other part. But the technical stuff, you've gone F9, so you're getting a decent depth of field, your shutter speed's not overly fast. I mean, you could quite easily trade off another f-stop from the shutter speed to the aperture, but yeah, it works reasonably well from that point of view. Right, Tanya, well, good use of your f13 to give you that depth of field, and you've managed to keep the whole of that image in nice clear sharp focus, which is good. I think your time of day isn't working as well as it could do for you. The beams that are here end up being quite bright, and there's no real texture or detail to them. I wonder what some of the other sides of the buttress in the building would have looked like, and whether or not the shadow on them would have picked up a little bit more in the way of detail. Compositionally, you've got that leading line up to the top, which is on the thirds. That's a good use. It would be nice to have a little bit wider image so that you actually bring up this line, potentially even a square crop from here, so you're bringing it up from the corner and giving you something strong to focus on, and maybe a little bit more room at the top as well. In this case, you end up with your eye running up to here, and there's not a huge amount of stuff to stop it and let it wander around. I don't know if there's a cross on the top of the building and you can get back and still keep using that same type of idea but give yourself a focal point. But the clear blue sky does work as a nice contrast to the yellow. Yeah, that was it for your one. Right, Daryl, really nice use of your vertical lines to lead you up to the top of the building. I think you're a little fraction too close. There's this gorgeous piece of gold at the top against the deep blue sky, and it's just a shame we're missing being able to see that quite properly. I think maybe 2 or 3 steps backwards, and you would have ended up with probably a fraction more of the building in the shot, but also managing to get all of that or more of that as a focal point. And as everything's leading up to there, that would have been really quite a good idea. Would have also given you would have also been good to give you a little bit more room at the top of the image, just for your eye to actually come to a natural rest before it starts coming back down to to look at the rest of the shot. Otherwise, everything's taking you up and out the top of the shot a little bit too much. Nice use of light. That's the side lighting is giving some really nice detail to the columns, but at the same time you've caught it where it's actually lighting up the doorway as well, and you've got enough detail in your shadows and things. So yeah, you've got a nice section of things going on there. 10mm, good fun, and you've managed to get to f11, both of which give you that nice depth of field. I think I said before you could have traded off a little bit more for your shutter speed for your f-stop, which is the general way to go. Given that you're using a 10mm lens, it's theoretically possible with a 10mm lens to handhold it for 1/10 of a second. I wouldn't necessarily say that isn't such a good idea. I'd probably stick to the 1/50th, but even so, that still gives you a little bit more f-stop to play with, i.e. get it up to that sweet spot of most lenses around the f16. But yeah, nicely done anyway. Right, Dan, you're quite right. It's a shame that bird or cloud didn't appear. And yes, after 40 minutes, I suspect you would have been getting some quite strange looks. The nice thing about this is you've got a touch of light just hitting the top of that building, and it does make for quite a nice contrast between the rest of the blues. Well exposed, you've got your f8, which is giving you the decent depth of field. There isn't anything in the sky that tells you that it's out of focus, so from that point of view it doesn't matter, and all your verticals and lines are leading up to that point in the center, and flipping or that bird didn't turn up. Oh well. If you're doing this shot For any other course, or if you're entering it into a Camera Club competition, of course, you don't have the requirements about not using Photoshop. So I would be very, very tempted. In fact, never mind tempted, I would go and Photoshop a bird into it. Just do it in such a way that nobody can tell that you've done it and you're fine, which means that you need to match the lighting. But yeah, and probably put the reflection of the bird in too, which gets a little bit interesting. But I think if you did that, it would really set the image off something shocking. And yeah, you're not faced with those regulations about Photoshop in Camera Club stuff unless it's a nature shot. It's not a nature shot, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, well seen, and pity that 40 minutes of waiting didn't pan out. Definitely worth entering into a competition though, with a small Photoshop tweak, and you're doing 106 almost certainly, so should have enough information about how to do that. Possibly not this week, possibly in a couple of weeks' time, but it will certainly come. By the time you've done the dinosaur task, you should be fairly fluent in that. If you're not, drop me an email and I'll see what I can do to help. Right, Simon, well, I really like the idea behind this one. You've already pointed out the fact that you've messed up your ISO, which is a bit of a shame, but you did have the right idea with your f-stop. The other thing that I would look at trying to tweak in terms of both composition and the position that you were when you took the photo is to try and get in so that this lamp stand is actually cropped out. Now, theoretically, if you can walk closer, then that's going to move off to the side a little bit comparatively, and you may just be able to still get the bottom of the steps in, although no, the bottom of the steps are going to get wider as well, which is a bit of a pain because that little bit of a curve does look quite nice. The other potential solution would be to use your barrel distortion and push it out. This is kind of getting fairly cheeky. Yeah, okay, you could push it out about that much and then crop in. The downside of doing that, of course, is that you've not got very much room at the top of the building, and the spire is already very close to the top, and so you needed a bit more room there, even in this image, but certainly to be able to play with. Now, you've got a fairly difficult lighting situation with the shadows and highlights, and at the moment you've managed to balance the two reasonably well. There is a lot of bright area down here and there's not a huge amount of visible detail. The good news is though that you do have detail in there if you just do a little bit of editing to bring it out, and most of that is just pulling down those highlights and then selectively adjusting the memorial stand, because that's a fairly key feature in that it's nicely lit, and so your eyes are automatically going to be drawn to it. If it's drawn to it in this situation, there's not enough detail to really set that off quite as much as it could. But yeah, I don't think you said you weren't you're not a local for this one, so maybe it's another one to try on a different trip. But you certainly got the right idea with it. The only other thing would probably be waiting until that group had actually come down the stairs, rather than them going up. Then you will actually get to see their faces, or just wait until they're gone and just have the two people who are kind of resting on the stairs as the key feature within the image. So yeah, hopefully that's useful for you. Right, Adrian, now, so from a technical point of view, you've executed this quite well. You've been using that f18. Potentially that's actually getting too high because it starts giving you an overall softness of your image, remember. But your exposure is okay, and there's no shake or anything in it. What's not working though is the fact that it's really flat, boring light, and you've got to wait until the right day so that the lighting is actually going to give you a really solid impact to the rest of the architecture. Without it, it just looks quite flat and can't think of a polite way of putting it, but boring. And yeah, I mean, this building has some quite interesting potential. The other thing that I would look at doing is cropping in. You've got that road running across, and it's not really adding anything to it. But yeah, it's all that white blocking, and without the sunlight to give it shape, it just merges into this one flat layer of white or cream. If you had that light coming in from different angles, then you're going to get this pickup of this angle here, and all of the caps are going to change, and the stairway is going to be a different shade, as is all of these other pieces. In fact, what I really recommend you do is head back out there and take the same shot on a sunny day, early morning or late evening, and see what a difference it makes with the feel of the image. Because as you pointed out, it was a very overcast day, and without that sense of spark to it, it just doesn't have anywhere near as much story and as much punch as it could have.